I'm Jennifer McSaveney. I'm a senior data analyst from the Ministry of Transport. I've been at the Ministry for a little over a decade now in the analytics and modelling team, and I'm here to talk about New Zealand Household Travel Survey in terms of just what is it, what do we use it for, how walking actually fits into the survey, how we're measuring it, and then as mode share is such a hot topic, just what is mode share and how we go about talking about it. So in terms of the household travel survey itself, it's a primary source of information on how, when, where and why people travel. As noted, it's a national travel survey. So it's designed to report on New Zealand travel patterns at a national and regional level on a roughly 3-year rolling average. So it isn't the biggest survey in the world, so I'm afraid it can't give you absolute fine detail and quite as much as you like. So for instance, we can report at a national level, a really major urban level, and but we can't really do down to TLA levels. In terms of what it's used for, it's a wide variety of purposes because it has the advantage that it is covering all transport modes domestically within New Zealand. So it's not just isolated asking about public transport or specifically walking, it's about day-to-day life, a travel diary for people filling in just what they did for 3 days or 2 days, or in certain circumstances 7 days, and how that fits in with the entire household. So not just one person in the house, but that entire household, that entire little community, and how they're going about that travel and how it fits in with everyone. And this is used to inform things like evidence for policy decisions. It started out as a risk assessment tool to be able to compare to crash and safety statistics to be able to get an idea of travel exposure to danger, etc. It also feeds into things from how long you might, when people might park their cars, whether or not you might have opportunities to charge, through to travel to school, which is clearly a very hot topic, through to things like just how much walking people do, how much cycling people do, and difficulties in access, etc. And that can be used from anything from evidence for policy making through to researchers use the data, through to used as underlying data for modelling how people might choose to make their choices in their daily lives, etc. So in terms of the history of the travel survey itself, it's a fairly busy survey where we interview people directly. So it's been going for a while now. We first started back 1989-90 was the first survey, and then 97-98, and then 2003 to 2014. And for that, the survey was run as face-to-face recruitment of people. And then they did a 2-day travel diary, and then there was a personal interview to connect up that information. Around about 2015, we thought, hey, there's new technologies, we may be able to improve things a bit. So we continued the face-to-face recruiting, but shifted to asking people to do a 7-day online travel diary. And we gave people the option of taking a little GPS memory unit, and that GPS recording unit, which would act as a memory prompt. So they could see in the online diary, take a look at a map and be able to see just where they've been. Unfortunately, it turns out that people are not so good at self-completing things online. A few things have held that up. And 7 days is actually a pretty big ask, especially when you're asking people to fill in for not just themselves, but for, say, the children in the household as well. So that turned out to be a bit too difficult for people. We didn't get as good a response rates as like. So from 2018 onwards, we switched back to, again, face-to-face recruitment, which is pretty important for getting that personal touch and as many people recruited as possible. Again, a 2-day assigned travel diary, and following up with a personal interview again to tease out those details, but still keeping that technology option of having, if you wanted, a GPS unit so that you could see those traces and see where people have gone. So in terms of how the survey is carried out, if you were experiencing the survey, you'd receive a letter to the household in the post saying that an interviewer would like you to take part. Could you please keep an eye out for them, and the survey company sends an interviewer to these randomly selected households throughout New Zealand, and they try to recruit people in the household. So we're trying to get everyone in the household, old, young, and everyone, to take part. And they're assigned a 2 days to record their travel. If they want to take the GPS unit, they can. And they carry it around with them. And they get the option of a paper form with a paper diary if they want to take notes. And then as soon as possible after those 2 assigned travel days, the interviewer will come back and go through the travel diary with them to find out the details of their travel. So in terms of the travel diary itself, we're trying to look at all the different trip legs within the day. So for each trip around, we're asking about what mode people used, the purpose of the travel, origin point, destination point, and within those modes, things like a few more details if it involves a vehicle. So the type of vehicle, household vehicle. For drivers, things like how many people were in the vehicle, not just household members, and also things like where they parked the vehicle, because you can get a bunch of information about that, as well as the different modes and the reasons for travel. And there's a bunch of other questions we ask about more general travel patterns for things that won't necessarily occur in the last 2 days. So in terms of the walking details in that travel diary, sorry, it's not all walking. I know we would like to get all exercise, but that's a hell of a lot to ask of people. So our primary focus is around that walking for transport, getting from A to B, and we're much more focused about the on-road footpath environment. So in terms of what we're counting towards walking, we're including jogging, we're including things like use of mobility scooters, wheelchairs, etc. So it's getting around, not in a vehicle. We also include things like wheeled pedestrians. So that includes things like skateboarders and kids on tricycles. Kick scooters get complicated. We have separated out e-scooters, we have separated out bicycles. Those are fairly new changes. So those are the sorts of things in terms of what we're classing as walking. In terms of where we're trying to monitor, as noted, we are looking at the transport side, on-road or footpath environment. It gets fuzzy about the boundaries of it, so we're not including tramping. So if you're going hiking in the Remutakas, sorry, we're not. We'll include you getting to the Remutakas in the first place to start your travels, but once you're at, they say national park or whatever, off-road, then it's not part of the records. And we're trying not to record things like trips on private property that start and end at the same place, and you're not crossing a road, and you're generally staying off-road the entire time. So some things are really nice and clear. For instance, I assume lots of people under lockdown were doing a lot of the left the house, walked around the block, hit the park and came home again. We definitely want to hear about those. But it's complicated by the inside the park bit, because we like to think life is straightforward, but actually when you start asking detailed questions, there's always the more complicated situations. So if we think about something like, say, Wellington Botanical Gardens, we're definitely interested if, and included in the survey, if you are crossing the Botanical Gardens on your way from A to B and you've started beforehand, you've cut through the Botanical Gardens, headed up past the Met Service or whatever, and then have continued to another location. We're definitely including the bit of your walking, which is through the Botanical Gardens. But if you've driven to the Botanical Gardens, parked inside, and then just walked around inside, kids have played at the playground for a bit, picked up an ice cream at the stall nearby, and then stayed within the Botanical Gardens, then leave via whichever mode, we will include your trip to the Botanical Gardens, but not the walking inside the Botanical Gardens. And similarly for things like shopping malls, the big covered ones, we're not including the travel inside the mall. But if it's an open series of streets, then, and you're crossing the streets, then we will cover it. It's also complicated by just how much people remember of the really short trip legs. So we don't really include walking, which is a really short distance, unless it involves crossing a road. Now that's a historical thing from, as I said, that road safety exposure thing. But the point to remember is the survey is reliant on people's memory, and people are fallible. They do the best they can. But if I'm going to ask you what you had for afternoon tea 3 days ago, you may or may not actually be able to remember that detail. So we do the best we can collecting what we can, but there will be small gaps in there around not picking up every single step of what's going on. Now, in terms of how we think about the travel, you can think about, we refer to trips. Trips is a pretty ambiguous phrase. You can think about it in a couple of ways. The travel survey tends to possibly break it down finer than most people might think. So we think of trip legs. Now, trip legs are segments of travel connected by a single travel purpose and mode. So we've got an illustration down the base of, say, I'm walking to the bus stop, catching the bus into town, and then walking to work or shopping, say. So that is a 3-trip leg sequence. And that first trip leg, the walking one, is the purpose of that is to change modes to get to a bus connection. And then you've got your second bus trip, which is another purpose of that trip is to change modes again, because you're going to have that third walking trip, which is to get to either working or shop. And that's your overall purpose for that sequence of trip legs, but each individual leg has a different purpose. So we aggregate those change mode trip legs into something called a journey. So if you think about it, journey to work, journey to school is those aggregations of those different trip legs. So that's how the survey records the information. That's a bit of information about how we think about walking in the survey. It's mostly clear, but there's occasionally a few sort of ambiguous bits because people are people and they do all sorts of things, and that's cool. Now, in terms of mode share, so we've heard from climate change talking about mode share, everyone's talking about mode share, just what is mode share and how we measure it. So the easiest thing to think about this is in, we're going to use stories, and this is my trip to work or journey to work. So my journey to work consists of 3 trip legs. The first one is I walk out of my house and walk down to the railway station. I'm Wellington based, so there's nice convenient trains. I then catch the train from my closest railway station into town, and then from there it's a reasonably short walk from the central train station to my office, the Ministry of Transport. So as I said, that's 3 trip legs. So if I talk about my mode share in terms of trip legs and my active mode use, 2/3, 67% of my mode share by trip leg is by active mode. However, we can also think about travel in terms of time spent traveling and in terms of distance traveled. So in terms of time spent traveling, it's about 8-minute walk for me to get to the railway station. I generally try and allow 10 minutes, and I can make it in less than 8, but that'll involve a fair amount of jogging. The railway train trip itself takes just over half an hour, so that's another 33 minutes. And then that walk to the from the station into the office is about another 8 minutes. Might be a little more waiting at the crossing signal outside the railway station, depending on traffic levels, etc. But it's not too long. So if you look at it in time in terms of mode share, I'm spending about 1/3 of my time in using active modes on my journey to work. But 2/3 of my time was PT on the train. Now, the other way to look at it is via distance travelled. Now, I'll note distance travelled is the one that tends to get reported in the Climate Commission report, because a lot of the vehicle CO2 emissions information is linked to the distance travelled by the vehicle. So a lot of that tends to be commenting on distance mode share because they're interested in the CO2 emissions. So in terms of the distance I'm travelling to get to work, it's about 800 metres from home to the station. It's about 26 k's on the train. It's difficult to tell via Google Maps. They keep telling me what the distance is for the cars, but not by the PT system. That's an odd thing, but it's about that. And then it's a little less than 800 metres to get from the station to the office. So in terms of distance mode share by active modes, I'm only talking about 6% for my active mode share use walking to get to work. So you'll note that's a much lower percentage. It's not that these things are wrong, they're just different ways of looking at the same picture. Now, another one you tend to hear asked about is the main mode share for the journey to work, which is the question which is asked in the census. Now, that one's asking about the mode that is used by distance to get to your location. And if I look just based on distance for the census, I just use PT. The main mode share by maximum distance travelled was actually just PT. So my active mode share based on journey to work for the census is actually 0%. Now, this is just one journey sequence. Our lives are built up and our measurements built up of all those different amounts added up together and seeing what the distribution is. But it does mean that you can see quite a difference depending on what you're measuring and how you're looking at it. It's not that these things are wrong, it's just they're different lenses. So a slower mode will have a much smaller distance share than, say, time share. And trip legs depend on how you think about the different components of your trip. So there are different ways of looking at it. So what I've told you about has been what the household travel survey is. It's a survey. We're doing the best we can. We're trying to get as much of an overall picture of what people are doing, how they're doing it, and all those different modes linking together and how it fits into people's lives, and using that information to try and make better decisions. And one of those aspects is around walking and mode share, just how it fits in, and it's a particular lens. You will get slightly different ideas on how you look at things, and they're just different lenses on how you're looking at it. Now, if you want more information about the travel survey, we've got 2 bits on the ministry website. So there's a section about the travel survey itself and some of the historical results. One that you may be quite interested in was one we put out a couple of years ago called 25 Years in New Zealand Travel, which has been looking at general travel trends, and there's a bunch of discussion about overall travel patterns and how they've changed. In that, we do have, for the travel survey, an email address for queries, and we have actual more latest results for things on the ministry website in the statistics and insight section under household travel and a variety of other areas. And I think that probably covers most of the things.
And being chair, I'm going to ask the first question. So if we're only measuring walking, and I understand there's a whole range of complexity in the terminology, but if we're only measuring walking for transport, whatever that means exactly, who is measuring walking and all the other ways that people do walking as part of activity and a whole range of other things? So we've got some questions in the chat, so if other people put questions in the chat or raise your hand, we'll kick on. So if you have a go at that one, please.
That is an interesting question. It's complicated. I know that there used to be a sports and recreation survey that used to get into general sort of health measures and overall levels of activity. We've had the particular lens and focus we have because we are the Ministry of Transport, but we are aware that it's just one facet of how people are walking around the place. I'm not certain who else is asking what. There may or may not be questions around general levels of physical activity in the Ministry of Health survey. They may or may not have sections on that.
Okay.
Yeah, it really varies.
That was a bit unfair, but hey, so I had to ask it. So there's some questions in the chat. So Chris's one leads on a little bit from that, and then I'll go back to Andrew's. But Chris asks, is the household travel survey only wanted by a Ministry of Transport for transport purposes? For instance, bus services, scheduling, walking overbridge need, etc. Is it not interested in the health and wellbeing aspects of walking? It's just disappeared. And if not, why not? The lack of counting recreational walking suggests that MOT is only interested in the utility transport aspect. So that kind of leads on from my one. So I'm not sure if Chris thinks that was answered or...
So I definitely know that it's not just the ministry who are interested in the information from the household travel survey. It doesn't go down to the level of asking about walking over bridges and direct geographic centric infrastructure and location things. It is a national and regional picture, but I also know that it's been used for a whole bunch of health research and other things. So for instance, there's several researchers from University of Otago and I think University of Auckland have used information from the household travel survey to be able to look at travel patterns, looking at things from walkability through to information about potential mode shift between different trip legs, how the trip legs link up, and how you might be able to look at capacity for mode shift in those legs. So for things like distances travelled in legs, whether particular shortest legs are susceptible to, or not just susceptible, but people have the capacity to be able to change those legs, and what might those potential mode shares and health improvements from that increase in active transport look like. So it's definitely not just being used in a strictly transport context. There is much wider research being done using the information.
Okay, thanks. So here's a question from Andrew Macbeth. He says, if you can't report in great detail at a local level, this is presumably because the sample size is too small. Given the government's declaration of a climate emergency and the recognition that transport is a major contributor to climate degradation, why not ask to double or treble the budget so you can survey more people more often? That's like a good idea. What do you think?
The amount the survey costs and the amount of budget we're able to spend is unfortunately well above my pay grade. I will note that we spend the budget we can, but the survey is also set up such that organisations like Waka Kotahi and local government organisations can actually put in money to buy purchases of expanded sample in their area. So we have had that in the past 3 years. I think Auckland Transport has purchased extra sample for Auckland to be able to improve their transport models. I know there was a similar exercise with Tauranga Bay of Plenty and Greater Wellington, and I think Waikato as well, though several of those were unfortunately cut short by the lockdowns due to COVID, since while the advantage of getting better information face-to-face surveying, there are certain circumstances now you cannot face-to-face survey in. So we can't collect data. We have provisions for up to level 2, but we're certainly not going to risk people at level 3 and above. So there is that limitation on things. But there are those potentials for expanding things. But you're up against there's only so much money to go around.
Thanks. So we've just got time for a couple of quick questions left before we go to our Clear Pascoe Walk 21 presentation. So Perry's asked, is there any chance that councils might be supported by government to provide extra, granular detail through counters or something like that?
So the travel survey, I know the travel survey expansions that I've talked have been organised because they've been part of the modelling work. It has involved, in some cases, there are a variety of funding mechanisms that are not just councils funding expansions, so far as I'm aware. But again, that's well above my pay grade.
Sorry, Jennifer, we're asking all the tricky questions. So here's a really good one from Kirsten. It says, can you walk towards including a question if a trip wasn't taken? For instance, somebody couldn't take a trip because the infrastructure wasn't good. It was inaccessible in some way. So it's kind of paraphrasing, which is a bad idea. Or that the cost was too high. So that sort of question.
So we do include a general question about, because the difficulty is always knowing what travel people couldn't do or weren't able to do. That's a great deal of detail, and asking about a 2-day travel diary is actually a lot of questions to people. It's potentially an hour longer thing, so it's quite a bit of work, and we really appreciate that people are willing to answer that much. We do ask people if they didn't go anywhere that day, just why they didn't go anywhere. So there are some options around sort of didn't have anything to do, which is fair enough, through to the didn't have access to transport, were homesick or working from home, things like that. So we've got a little bit more information like that. Unfortunately, by the time you're getting down to the details of whether or not a particular route is accessible for someone, and as to whether they have the options of there may be a better accessible route, but it's much longer, versus the how they can get to things, it gets really complicated.